Welcome back to the deep dive. You guys wanted it, so here it is, the American Revolution.
Awesome.
We're diving into a podcast episode today from Freedom Chronicles, Understanding the American Revolution.
Okay.
It's called, What Were the Main Causes and Outcomes of the American Revolution?
Yeah.
We're going to uncover some really interesting stuff.
Cool. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, we're going way beyond the typical textbook stuff.
All right, let's get into it. Where do we even begin with something as massive as the American Revolution?
Well, the episode kind of throws us right onto this, global stage.
Okay.
Apparently, the French and Indian War, fought here.
Yeah.
It had a huge impact on the relationship between Britain and the colonies
Mm-hmm.
because it left Britain in a lot of debt.
Right. Makes sense. Wars are expensive.
And they decided, hey, the colonies, you guys are going to help us pay for this through taxes.
Oh, I bet that went over well.
You know that saying, no taxation without representation?
Yeah, classic.
It wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was like a real visceral reaction from the colonists. They felt it was super unfair.
I mean, yeah, being taxed by a government you have no say in, that's got to be frustrating.
Exactly. And it really started to solidify this idea of a distinct American identity.
Interesting. So they're starting to see themselves as separate from Britain.
Yeah. And it wasn't just taxes. The podcast talks about this whole chain of events that really, fueled the fire.
Okay, like what? What else happened?
Well, it all starts with the Proclamation of 1763. Basically, after Britain won the French and Indian War, they drew this line down the Appalachian Mountains
Uh-oh. I have a feeling I know what's coming next.
and told the colonists they had to stay on the east side.
So no westward expansion?
Nope. They were trying to avoid more conflict with Native Americans and stuff.
Trying to manage a massive empire from across an ocean, huh?
Right. But it was a huge blow to the colonists. Imagine looking west and seeing all that potential land, and suddenly you're told, nope, off limits.
Yeah, that's gotta sting.
Definitely added fuel to the fire.
So we've got economic resentment brewing, a growing sense of American identity, and now restrictions on westward expansion. What's next in this chain reaction?
Things are about to get really interesting. The podcast talks about the Stamp Act and then the Townshend Acts. A whole bunch of new taxes.
Oh, just everything.
Pretty much. Legal documents,
Mhm.
tea, you name it.
Oh boy, here comes the tea.
And yeah, these acts caused a lot of protests and boycotts.
Rightfully so.
And then, of course, you have the Boston Tea Party.
The ultimate act of defiance.
Tossing all that tea into Boston Harbor was a direct challenge to British authority. It grabbed everyone's attention.
What was Britain's response to that? I can't imagine they were too happy.
Oh, they weren't. They retaliated with the Intolerable Acts. Basically, they tried to clamp down even harder on the colonies. Made things worse.
So the tension just keeps escalating, each side pushing back harder.
Exactly. But in the midst of all this, you see the colonies starting to come together. They formed the First Continental Congress.
Oh, wow. So they're organizing now.
Yeah. It was a huge step. They went from scattered protests to a more unified resistance.
Yeah.
They're starting to think and act as one.
A united front. This is getting serious.
And then comes the moment everyone knows. The shot heard round the world. The clash at Lexington and Concord.
The start of the war.
Exactly. It was the point of no return. Things would never be the same.
And it all happened so fast, didn't it? From the first rumblings of discontent to armed conflict, it was, what, less than 20 years?
Yeah, something like that. A lot happened in a very short period of time. And less than a year and a half after Lexington and Concord, they signed the Declaration of Independence.
Wow, that's a bold move, a real turning point in history.
Absolutely.
So they declared independence, but actually winning that fight, that's a whole other story.
That's where things get even more interesting.
Yeah.
The podcast really dives into the Declaration itself. Reminds us it wasn't just a list of complaints.
Oh, yeah.
It was a powerful declaration of, Enlightenment ideals, freedom, liberty, equality.
Right. Those ideas were huge EE at the time.
It resonated far beyond the colonies, too. And the podcast doesn't just focus on the big picture stuff. It talks about the people involved, like, obviously, George Washington, John Adams, Ben Franklin.
The founding fathers.
But also Abigail Adams.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, she was a huge advocate for women's rights during all this.
I didn't know that. It's cool that they're highlighting these different voices.
Makes you wonder, how many other stories are out there that we don't know about? All those everyday people who contributed to the revolution.
For sure. So we've talked about the causes, the key events, the declaration. But what about the aftermath? What happened after they actually won?
That's where the podcast goes next. He talks about the challenges of, like, building a new nation from scratch.
Right, because declaring independence is one thing, but actually governing, that's a whole other ballgame.
Exactly. So the Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially recognizes the United States, but then they had to figure out how to govern themselves.
Right. How did that go?
Well, first they tried the Articles of Confederation.
It didn't last long.
Yeah, it didn't really work. It gave too much power to the individual states.
Makes sense. They were probably trying to avoid anything that resembled the British monarchy.
Yeah, I think there was this fear of having a strong central government.
But they needed something to hold the nation together.
Right. They needed a stronger federal system to, like, tackle bigger issues, have a more unified identity. So enter the U.S. Constitution.
Okay, so how did they even come up with that?
It was a pretty intense process, according to the podcast. Lots of debate, arguments about how to balance the power between the states and the federal government, how to protect individual liberties.
And, of course, the elephant in the room. Slavery.
Yeah, they couldn't avoid that issue forever. And it definitely casts a shadow over everything.
It's amazing how they were able to create something as enduring as the Constitution, given all those challenges.
It makes you realize winning independence was just the first step. Building a stable, just, and unified society, well, that's a constant work in progress.
For sure. And the podcast makes another interesting point. The American Revolution had a global impact.
What do you mean?
Well, the colonists' success inspired other movements for independence all over the world, almost like a domino effect.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it like that. So other countries were watching and taking notes.
Absolutely. The French Revolution, for example, was directly inspired by the American experience. And then it spread to Latin America and other parts of the world. People saw that it was possible to challenge the old order and create something new.
That's incredible. So the American Revolution wasn't just about 13 colonies breaking away.
Yeah.
It sparked a global wave of change.
Exactly. And the podcast really emphasizes the lasting legacy of those revolutionary ideals. Freedom, self-determination, democracy. Those ideas continue to shape the world we live in.
It's inspiring, but also kind of sobering, because those ideals aren't always easy to live up to.
You're right. And the podcast acknowledges that. It points out that issues like slavery and gender equality weren't fully addressed during the revolution. In some ways, the fight for a truly just and equitable society was just beginning.
Yeah, progress isn't always a straight line. There are setbacks, challenges, and sometimes the pursuit of a better world requires constant struggle.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how far we've come and how far we still have to go.
It does. But before we wrap up, tell me, did this podcast episode dig up any, like, fun facts about the American Revolution? You know, those little details that make history come alive?
Oh, for sure. Did you know the first official Independence Day celebration actually happened on July 4th, 1777?
Wait, really? So we've been celebrating on the 4th of July for, like, almost 250 years.
Yep.
I bet they had fireworks even back then.
You know it. Fireworks were already a tradition in Europe, and it seems the colonists were all about it. They even had bonfires and lit up their houses with candles.
It's cool how some traditions just stick around, you
Yeah.
know? So we've covered a lot in this deep dive, from, like, global tensions and colonial grievances to, you know, the birth of a new nation.
And its impact on the world, it's a pretty big story.
It is. But why should our listeners care about a revolution that happened centuries ago?
That's the key question, right? And this podcast episode gives us some good answers. First, it reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about ideas, about, like, struggles for power, about people trying to create a better future. And those themes are timeless, you know?
Yeah, it's like we can see ourselves in those struggles.
Exactly. And second, it highlights the power of ordinary people to create change. I mean, the American Revolution wasn't led by kings or emperors. It was driven by regular people.
Farmers, shopkeepers, you know, everyday people. That's pretty inspiring.
Totally. It reminds us that we all have the potential to make a difference.
Even when things seem impossible.
Exactly. And finally, the podcast challenges us to think about the legacy of the revolution. Those ideals of freedom, self-determination, democracy, they aren't just words on a page.
Right. They require action.
Exactly. We have to keep working to make them a reality.
It's like a torch that's passed down through generations. And it's up to us to keep that flame alive.
Well said. And to wrap things up, the podcast ends with a question for the listener. How do the ideals of the American Revolution, freedom, self-determination, and democracy resonate with current events around the world?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
It makes us connect the past to the present and see how those revolutionary ideas are still relevant today. But we'll leave you with one final thought, one the podcast didn't ask. Imagine yourself transported back to the time of the American Revolution.
Okay.
Which side would you have been on, and why?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
It is, but it might reveal something about your own values and beliefs. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep exploring, and keep those revolutionary spirits alive.